Hello everyone, and thank you for clicking on this video. Are you having trouble falling asleep? You're in the right place. The Scary Nightmare is here to help you find peace before bed. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any updates that will help you relax. Now, lie down comfortably, take a deep breath, and let go of any tension. The story is about to begin. Story 1. I moved into the house at the edge of town, an old stone building with a weathered charm. It had been abandoned for years, or so the neighbors said. They spoke of its history, of a family who once lived there, but the details were vague. The house was cheap, the location quiet. I was drawn to it immediately, sensing an inexplicable connection. The first few days were peaceful, spent in silence as I cleaned and unpacked my things. The house had a strange smell to it, a mix of dust and something else that I couldn't quite place. I ignored it, figuring it was just the aging wood and stone. The walls creaked in the night, a natural sound for an old house, I thought. There was nothing to worry about. But soon, I began to notice something odd. Late at night, when I lay in bed, the house would seem to shift. Not physically, at least not in any obvious way, but the air would grow thick, and the silence would become oppressive. It was as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to tell myself that it was the settling of the house, the pipes groaning or the floorboards bending under the weight of time. But I knew deep down that there was something more to it. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room reading a book, I heard a soft sound from the walls. At first, I thought it was the house settling again. But then it happened again. Faint scraping noises, like something or someone was moving inside the walls. I froze, staring at the spot where the noise had come from, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I listened carefully, but the sound stopped. I chalked it up to the old house's quirks. The next night, the noise returned. This time, it was more distinct. There was a rhythmic tapping, almost like fingernails gently drumming against the inside of the walls. I stood up and moved cautiously toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pressed my ear to the wall, the tapping grew louder, as though something was trying to get out. I pulled back, the chill of fear creeping up my spine. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that it was just the wind or the house's old pipes, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I had lived in enough old homes to know the difference between the natural sounds of an old house and something that didn't belong. The noises continued over the next few days, growing louder and more persistent. It was as if whatever was trapped inside the walls was getting more desperate. I started to feel watched, as though invisible eyes were always on me, lurking just beyond my vision. At night, I would wake to the sound of faint scratching at the walls, the sensation of something pressing against the other side. I couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, I decided to investigate. I found a small crack in the wall in the hallway, the kind of crack that comes with age. I pried it open with a screwdriver, the wood groaning in protest. As the crack widened, the scratching intensified. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled the wall apart. The darkness inside the wall was thick, like a shadow that had been living there for years. I shone my flashlight inside. At first, I saw nothing but the emptiness of the hollow wall. But as I moved the light, I saw something else. Eyes. Dozens of them, reflecting the light in a way that made my stomach turn. The eyes were unblinking, frozen in place, but they were unmistakable. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. As I stepped back, the scratching noise intensified, louder now, like something was trying to break free. I tried to block it out, to pretend it wasn't happening, but the fear was too overwhelming. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. The house felt alive, as though it was pulling me deeper into its web. There was something in those walls, something old and hungry. The days passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the eyes in the wall. I could hear them now, even when the house was silent. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. The tapping and scratching continued, relentless and maddening. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I went. The house seemed to have a hold on me. Then one night, I woke to find myself standing in front of the wall. The room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the crack where I had pried open the wood. My hands were covered in blood, and I didn't remember how they got there. My heart raced as I realized that I had been sleepwalking, pulled by something I couldn't understand. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut. The windows, too, were sealed tight, and I realized that I was trapped. The air grew thick, and the scratching came from all directions now. The eyes in the walls were everywhere, watching me, their gaze suffocating. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, as if something was waiting for me to make the next move. Suddenly, the wall began to crumble. Slowly at first, then faster, as if the very structure of the house was coming undone. The eyes in the walls grew larger, the dark shapes behind them moving in ways that made no sense. They were reaching out, pulling at the walls, trying to escape. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body unwilling to obey. The darkness poured from the walls like ink, filling the room, consuming everything. I could hear the whispers now, faint but unmistakable, like a chorus of voices calling to me from within the walls. They were beckoning me closer. And then, it happened. The walls fell away, revealing a mass of dark, twisted shapes. I didn't recognize them at first, but as they emerged from the rubble, I saw them for what they were. People, their eyes wide open, their faces frozen in horror. They were the original occupants of the house, their bodies twisted and contorted in impossible ways. They reached for me, their hands cold and skeletal, their eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. The darkness enveloped me, pulling me into the walls, into the void that had existed in the house for so long. I was trapped, just another soul claimed by the house, another set of eyes in the walls. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the flicker of light in the cracks of the stone. The house had taken me. Story 2. The cabin sat quietly at the edge of the forest, nestled between tall pines and thick underbrush. It had been abandoned for years, its windows covered in grime and the wooden planks weathered from years of neglect. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, seeking solitude away from the noise of the city. It seemed perfect, a small, rustic place, far from anyone, where I could find some peace and rest. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, made a simple meal, and sat in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackling wood. The air outside had grown cold, and the wind moaned through the trees. The cabin felt warm and safe, a sanctuary from the relentless pace of modern life. But as the night stretched on, I began to notice something strange. There was a subtle sound, like a faint tapping against the walls. I attributed it to the house settling, as old buildings often do. Yet the tapping persisted, growing rhythmic, almost like something was trying to get in or out. I stood still for a moment, listening. It was not from the outside. The sound was coming from inside the cabin, somewhere behind the walls. At first, I thought it was an animal trapped in the attic or a bird caught in the chimney. But the more I listened, the more I realized it wasn't random. The tapping had a pattern, deliberate, almost like someone or something was trying to communicate. I shivered at the thought but brushed it aside, blaming the isolation and the silence for making my mind jump to strange conclusions. The next day, I went out for a hike in the woods. The trees towered over me, their trunks thick and dark, blocking much of the light. I walked for hours, lost in thought, enjoying the solitude. But the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air was still, too still. The quiet was oppressive, and a strange heaviness settled on my chest. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, my body exhausted but my mind restless. I didn't want to be there anymore, but I convinced myself to stay for one more night. The tapping in the walls had grown louder since the previous evening, though it was still faint, hidden just beneath the sound of the wind. That night, the tapping became more distinct, and it was no longer coming from the walls. I could hear it coming from the floorboards now. It was as if someone, or something, was moving beneath the cabin. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the sound, but it grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo through the floor, vibrating up into the bed. My heart began to race. I wanted to get up and check, but something held me there, paralyzed with fear. Then, as if in response to my fear, the floorboards creaked, and a low, groaning sound filled the room. The temperature in the cabin dropped, and I saw my breath fog in the cold air. The sound from below intensified, now more like a scraping, a dragging, as if something was crawling beneath the cabin, trying to break free. I finally mustered the courage to get up, my feet barely touching the floor as I moved toward the door. But before I could open it, a heavy thud echoed from beneath me. The sound seemed to shake the entire cabin. The door rattled, and I froze, my hand on the handle. The scraping noise continued, followed by a series of guttural sounds, low, drawn-out breaths, as if something was struggling to speak. I turned to face the empty room, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were silent now, the floor still, but the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. The oppressive air was suffocating, and I could hear the creaking of the beams above me. Slowly, I turned toward the small window, half covered in dust. The glass was cracked, the frame rotting away, but through it, I could see the woods beyond. They were dark now, shrouded in shadows. The trees swayed, but no wind moved them. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my eyes on the floorboards, the walls, waiting for the next sound, the next shift in the air. But nothing came. The tapping had stopped, leaving only the quiet hum of the wind outside. It wasn't until morning that I dared to leave the cabin. The following day, I packed my things and left, never looking back. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time in the rearview mirror. It stood there, still, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that something was still beneath it, waiting. I never returned to that place. To this day, I can't shake the memory of the tapping, the scraping, the feeling of something trying to claw its way out from the earth beneath the cabin. I've heard of other people who stayed in that cabin over the years, but none of them stayed long enough to talk about it. And I wonder if they heard the same things, felt the same unease, or if it was only me, drawn there for reasons I'll never understand. Story 3. The Forgotten Path. There was a path I used to walk every morning, a winding trail through the woods that led to a small pond. It was a peaceful place, a retreat where I could clear my head before starting my day. The trail was well trodden, the trees tall and protective, and the air always smelled fresh. I had walked this path for years without incident, but then, one morning, something changed. I woke early, as usual, and headed toward the woods. The sky was still dark, the stars barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. The path was familiar, and I found my way easily, even in the dim light. But that day, I noticed something different. The air was colder than usual, and the trees seemed to close in around me more than before. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just the season shifting, the days getting shorter. As I walked, the path seemed to shift. It wasn't obvious at first, but after a while, I realized that the familiar markers, the large stone, the old oak tree, were missing. The landscape was changing around me, subtly at first, but it grew more disorienting with each step. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I couldn't remember how far I had walked or how much time had passed. I turned back to retrace my steps, but found that the path behind me had disappeared. The trees were different now, darker, older. The ground beneath me felt soft and damp, as though I were walking on something that had been buried for years. I had heard stories about people getting lost in the woods, about paths that led to places they shouldn't, but I had always dismissed them as superstition. Now, with every step, a deep unease grew inside me. I could no longer see the familiar landmarks of the trail. and the woods felt endless, pressing in from all sides. I started to run, my breath quickening as panic set in. The trees seemed to blur together, and the ground felt uneven beneath me. I could hear the rush of water in the distance, but the pond was nowhere in sight. Then, as quickly as it had started, the woods opened up before me, and I found myself at a clearing. There was no pond, no familiar trail, just an empty, overgrown field. And in the center of the field was a large stone, covered in strange markings. I didn't approach it. I turned around and ran in the opposite direction, hoping to retrace my steps, but the woods seemed to have no end. The path had vanished, and I was left to wander in circles, my sense of time completely gone. Eventually, the sun began to rise, and I found myself standing at the edge of the woods once more. The path was back. The familiar trees were there, the air warmer. It was as if nothing had changed. I walked home in a daze, my heart still racing. The next day, I went back to the woods, but the path was gone. There was no sign of it, no trace. I searched for hours but found nothing. The woods had swallowed it up, as if the path had never existed. I haven't been back since. Story 4. The old apartment building was not particularly special, but it had everything I needed: affordable rent, quiet surroundings, and a sense of comfort that made it easy to settle in. The building was aging, of course, but that added to its charm. It had a history, one I knew little about, but I didn't mind. I had lived in old places before, and the creaks and groans of an old building felt comforting, almost familiar. The apartment itself was small, with only a few rooms, but it was enough for me. The first few nights were peaceful, no disturbances. But over time, I began to notice something strange, an unevenness in the floor. In the living room, there was a small section near the window where the floorboards slanted downward. I could feel it as I walked, a subtle dip that wasn't quite right. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the result of an old building settling. But the more time I spent in the apartment, the more the floor seemed to shift. The dip grew deeper, more pronounced, until it became impossible to ignore. I could feel it beneath my feet every time I walked across the room. The weight of it felt unnatural, as though the floor was absorbing my steps, as if something underneath was pulling at the edges of the boards. At night, the unease only grew. I began to hear faint noises coming from the floor, subtle at first, scraping sounds, like nails dragging across wood. I thought it was the building settling further, the result of the shifts in the floor. But the noises persisted, growing in volume and frequency until they became a constant, like something moving underneath the floor, restless, waiting. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just part of the building's age. But the more the noises continued, the more I felt an unsettling presence in the apartment. It was as though the space itself had become wrong, as if it were not truly mine. One evening, I couldn't stand it any longer. I decided to investigate, to see if I could figure out what was causing the shifting floor. I moved the rug and carefully examined the area where the dip was most noticeable. The floor was old, covered in stains and scratches, but nothing seemed out of place. That was until I noticed a faint crack along the edge of one of the boards. I bent down and carefully pried the edge of the board up, revealing a small cavity beneath it. My heart began to race as I reached inside, pulling out what I found: a bundle of old, yellowed papers, tied with string. I unfurled them slowly, revealing notes written in a scrawling hand. The writing was faded, but it was clear enough to read, "Help me. I'm below. They're coming." The words were unsettling, but there was no time to process them. A loud crack echoed through the room, followed by a deep groan. The floor beneath me began to shake violently, and I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. The sound of something large moving beneath the apartment filled the air, as if the very foundation was shifting. The walls groaned in protest, and I could feel the entire building trembling. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle was stuck, and the lock refused to budge. The noises from below grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was hidden beneath the floor was trying to escape. I turned back, looking around the room, desperately searching for another way out. The apartment felt smaller, as though the walls were closing in on me. And then, with one final, deafening crack, the floor split open. A dark, inky void appeared in the center of the room, swallowing the floorboards, and from the depths below, something reached upward. Long, skeletal hands, pale and twisted, emerged, their fingers scraping across the floor in search of something, or someone. The last thing I remember was the cold touch of those hands as they gripped my legs, pulling me toward the gaping hole in the floor. I couldn't scream. The air was thick with terror, suffocating. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. The floor had been repaired, the cracks sealed, and everything appeared as though nothing had ever happened. The building looked as it always had, old, worn, but familiar. But when I walked through the hallway, I noticed something strange. The floor was uneven. A slight dip, barely noticeable, but there. And the air felt different, thicker, as though something had changed in the space, something hidden just beneath the surface. And then I heard it. A faint scraping noise, coming from below. Story 5. I had recently moved into an old townhouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was charming, with its worn-out wooden floors, narrow staircases, and high ceilings. It wasn't the most modern place, but it had character, and I appreciated that. The price was right, and the location was peaceful, surrounded by trees and fields. The first few days were uneventful, but there was one peculiar detail that stood out: a single light in the hallway that flickered intermittently. It wasn't constant, but it was frequent enough to notice. I thought it was just an old bulb, so I replaced it with a new one. But even after that, the flickering continued. At first, it wasn't much of a concern. It was just a light, after all. But soon, I began to notice something strange. The flickering would happen at night, just as I was about to fall asleep. It would start with a faint buzz, and then the light would flicker, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. The shadows moved in strange ways, never quite matching the shape of the objects around them. It wasn't just the light. I began to feel as though I wasn't alone in the house. There were times when I would be sitting in the living room, reading, and I would hear footsteps in the hallway, faint and soft, as though someone was walking just out of sight. I would call out, but no one answered. I checked the house, but it was always empty. The strange occurrences continued for weeks. The flickering light became more frequent, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, longer. The sound of footsteps in the hall persisted, and sometimes I would hear soft breathing near my ear, as if someone were standing just behind me. I couldn't explain it, and every time I tried to rationalize it, the sensations became stronger, more overwhelming. One night, after the light flickered again, I decided to confront whatever was causing it. I stood in the hallway, staring at the light, waiting for it to flicker again. And then, as if on cue, it did. But this time, it wasn't just the light. The shadows on the walls began to move, shifting and swirling, as though they had a life of their own. I could see shapes forming in the darkness, twisted figures that seemed to watch me, their faces obscured. I stepped back, my heart racing, and the air grew colder. The shadows seemed to grow larger, pressing in on me, and the soft breathing grew louder. I turned and ran, but the footsteps followed, echoing in the hallway, getting closer with each step. I couldn't outrun them, and no matter how fast I moved, they were always just behind me. I reached the stairs, but the steps were steep, and the shadows seemed to crawl up the walls, inching toward me. I stumbled, losing my footing, and when I turned to look, the hallway was empty. The light flickered one last time, and then everything went dark. The next morning, I found myself lying in the hallway, confused and disoriented. The light was working properly, and there was no sign of the shadows. But I knew something had changed. The air felt heavier, thicker. I wasn't alone in the house anymore. I could feel the presence, lingering just beyond my sight. I moved out shortly after. The townhouse remained empty for months. No one ever stayed for long. These stories continue with quiet, creeping horror, each with an unsettling presence that grows more powerful over time. If you would like more stories or different themes, let me know. Story 6. The Empty Chair. I found the old chair in a small antique shop on the corner of the street. It was a beautiful piece, crafted from dark wood with intricate carvings along its backrest. The upholstery was worn, but the patterns were still visible, faded but elegant. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a stoic expression, told me it had been passed down through generations. It was the only item left from an old family estate that had long been forgotten. It seemed like the perfect addition to my modest apartment. When I brought it home, it fit neatly into the corner of the living room, tucked near the window. It didn't stand out, but it gave the room a certain character that I hadn't noticed before. The first few days were normal, the chair just another object in the room. But over time, I began to notice something odd. At night, I would wake to find the chair facing the opposite direction. Each time, I could swear it had been facing the window, but when I would wake up, it was turned toward the center of the room, as if it were watching me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Perhaps I had moved it without realizing. I turned the chair back to its original position, dismissing it as a momentary lapse in memory. But the next night, the same thing happened. It was facing the opposite way again, as if someone had moved it. As days passed, the behavior became more frequent. Sometimes, the chair would be slightly turned, others it would be fully reversed. I decided to tie a piece of string around one of the legs, hoping to catch the movement if it happened again. But when I woke up the next morning, the string was gone. The chair was now positioned in the center of the room, as though it had been dragged. The feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. I started to feel a presence around the chair, as if something was silently watching from the shadows. It was subtle at first, just a faint chill in the air around it. But then, I started to hear faint creaks, like someone was sitting in it, shifting their weight, adjusting their position. I would turn to look, but there would be no one there. One night, after waking to find the chair once again facing me, I stood still and stared at it, trying to ignore the unease building inside me. The room was quiet, too quiet, and the silence pressed in on me. It was then that I noticed something even stranger. The chair, which had once seemed a mere object, now appeared darker, as though the wood had absorbed something over time, something I couldn't quite define. I moved closer to it, almost drawn to it, and as I reached out to touch the armrest, I froze. The wood felt unnaturally cold, much colder than the surrounding air. But I couldn't pull my hand away. It was as though the chair had a magnetic pull, keeping my fingers locked in place. I could feel the weight of something in the room, a suffocating presence that grew with every second. The chair groaned as if under the weight of something, though there was nothing there. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, as though the space itself had become tighter. The shadows around the chair seemed deeper, as if they were swallowing the light. Suddenly, I felt a shift in the air, like a subtle pressure change, and I pulled my hand away, backing into the corner of the room. The chair was now facing me directly, the shadows around it thickening, as though it had been waiting for me. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching the chair, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, I turned away, the weight in my chest too much to bear. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The sensation of being watched followed me, and I could still hear the faint creaks of the chair in my mind. The next morning, I decided it was time to get rid of it. I called the antique shop, but when I asked about the chair, the shopkeeper didn't seem to remember it. He told me there was no such chair in his store. I checked the apartment again, but it was gone. The corner where it had once sat was empty. I searched the entire room, but it was as if the chair had never existed at all. Yet, every night since, when I lie in bed, I feel the presence again, the weight of someone sitting in the chair, just beyond my sight. I don't dare look. I don't want to see it. Story 7. The mirror was old, framed in tarnished gold, and had been hanging in my family's living room for as long as I could remember. It had always been there, a fixture on the wall. I never thought much of it, as mirrors tend to be just objects we look into to adjust our appearance, nothing more. But over time, I started to notice something strange. At first, it was only subtle, a flicker, a small shift in the reflection that didn't quite match reality. I would catch it from the corner of my eye, a slight distortion in the glass, but when I looked directly at it, everything would appear normal. As days passed, the feeling grew. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. The reflection began to move in ways that didn't align with my own actions. I would see myself in the mirror, but my reflection would sometimes be a second behind or a moment too early. At other times, my reflection would smile or frown when I wasn't. I tried to ignore it, but each time I stood before the mirror, it became harder to dismiss. The reflection began to take on a life of its own, moving independently of me. Sometimes, when I walked away from it, my reflection would stay, frozen in place, staring back at me. The unsettling nature of it grew with every day. I would stand in front of the mirror, terrified to move, to blink, afraid that my reflection would do something unexpected. It wasn't just that the reflection was out of sync. It was as though it was trying to communicate something, trying to reach out to me, to pull me into the glass. I tried covering the mirror, but the next day, it would be uncovered, as if someone had removed the cloth. I moved the mirror to different rooms, thinking that perhaps it was tied to that particular spot. But no matter where I placed it, the reflection remained. It would follow me, as though it had become a part of me. Then, one evening, I stood before the mirror, watching as my reflection moved ahead of me. I tried to ignore the overwhelming dread rising in my chest, but it was impossible. My reflection turned to face me, its smile widening unnaturally. I froze, staring at it. The reflection reached out, pressing its fingers against the glass, its eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. It was as if my reflection had become something separate, something alive. I could feel it pulling at me, trying to drag me into the mirror, into that dark world behind the glass. And then, with one final terrible movement, the reflection reached out, its hand emerging from the glass, cold and unnatural. The last thing I saw was its hand gripping my wrist, pulling me toward it, the glass growing colder as I was drawn into it. The next morning, the mirror was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere, and I never found it again. But at night, when I look into any reflective surface, I can still feel its gaze on me, watching, waiting. These stories continue with the same slow-building atmosphere, with subtle but powerful horror elements that remain unnerving without resorting to exaggeration. Let me know if you'd like to explore more or change the direction. Story 8. I had lived in the old house for nearly a year before I noticed it. The door at the end of the hallway. It was a small, plain door, tucked away in a corner behind a faded, frayed curtain. I passed it every day on my way to the kitchen or the bathroom, but for the longest time, I didn't give it much thought. It was just another door, like the others in the house. But one evening, as I walked past it again, something caught my attention. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I passed by earlier. It had always been locked, but there it was, cracked open, just a small gap. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I stepped closer to the door, my hand resting on the knob. There was no sound coming from behind it, but I could feel an odd stillness in the air. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. I didn't know what I expected to find on the other side, but I couldn't bring myself to open it fully. I shut the door quickly, and the latch clicked shut. The door remained locked after that. Every time I passed by it, it looked exactly as it always had, unassuming and ordinary. But something about it lingered in my thoughts, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was simply being paranoid. After all, what could be behind a door that had remained locked for so long? Days passed, and I grew used to the idea of the locked door. But then, one night, I woke in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. The sound of scratching came from somewhere in the house. At first, I thought it was the wind or some animal outside, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, like nails scraping against wood. It was coming from behind the locked door. I lay in bed, unable to move. The scratching continued, slow and methodical, as if whatever was behind the door was trying to get out. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the sound was maddening. It seemed to echo through the house, filling every corner with a low, rasping noise. The next morning, I found the door slightly open again. I hadn't touched it, and yet, it was cracked just enough for me to see the darkness beyond. The scratching was gone, but the silence that followed was even more unsettling. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Instead, I decided to leave it be. I tried to put the door out of my mind, but as the days went on, I began to notice other things. Small, subtle changes in the house. Furniture slightly shifted, objects in different places. It was as if the house itself was moving, rearranging things when I wasn't looking. And always, the door remained, locked but ever present, the scratching continuing in my mind. Then, one evening, after I had come home from work, I found the door open wide. My heart sank as I stepped toward it, but I couldn't turn back. The silence in the house was suffocating, and I knew that I had to see what was behind it, once and for all. I stepped into the room beyond the door, my breath shallow as I moved further into the darkness. But there was nothing. Just an empty room, its walls bare, the floor covered in dust. The only thing that stood out was a small, worn chair in the center of the room, facing the door. I stared at it, unsure of what to think, and as I took a step forward, something caught my eye. A shadow, a dark shape near the corner of the room. I froze, my mind racing. There was nothing there, no figure, no movement, just the empty space. I backed out of the room, slowly, shutting the door behind me. It clicked shut with a finality that made the house feel colder. I locked the door, but the sensation of something lingering, something waiting, stayed with me. The scratching, the silence, the presence behind that door. It had never gone away. It was just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Story 9. The house was large, older than most in the neighborhood, and it had a peculiar charm that made it feel like a home from another time. I moved in, seeking a fresh start after a difficult year, and while the house itself felt warm, there was something about the hall that unsettled me. The hallway stretched long and narrow, with doors on either side and old photographs hanging along the walls. There was one door at the end that I never opened. It wasn't locked or sealed, but something about it kept me from going near it. The other rooms were fine, quiet, empty, unremarkable, but the hallway was always different. At night, when I walked through the hall to get to the kitchen, I could feel something in the air. A heaviness. It wasn't the house settling, it was something else. I often had the feeling of being watched, of something standing just out of sight. The shadows seemed to grow longer in the evening, pressing against the walls, twisting in ways they shouldn't. It was always the same, no matter how many times I walked through it. The shadows at the end of the hall were the most disturbing. I tried to ignore it, but after a while, it became too much. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding in the hall, waiting for me. I would hurry through it, not daring to look at the darkened end, but it was always there, hovering just at the edge of my vision. One evening, as I passed through the hall, I noticed a subtle shift in the shadows. It was as if they were moving, slowly, deliberately. I stopped, my breath catching, and turned toward the end of the hall. The darkness was thick, but I could see something, or someone, standing there, just outside the reach of the light. I took a step back, the air growing colder around me. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest as I slowly backed away. The presence was overwhelming, pressing in on me, and I knew, deep down, that it was not something I could ignore. I turned to leave, but the moment I did, the shadows shifted again, creeping closer to me, like fingers reaching out from the darkness. The air was thick, and my skin tingled with the sensation of being surrounded. I ran, not looking back, and locked myself in one of the rooms. The next morning, the hallway was empty. The shadows were no longer pressing against the walls. The silence was heavy, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The hall had always been waiting, and it would always be there, hiding in the darkness, watching. Story 10. The staircase in my new home was old, creaking under the weight of every step I took. It had been refinished at some point, but the steps were still uneven, the wood warped from years of use. It wasn't a particularly dangerous staircase, but it was uncomfortable to climb, especially in the dark. I made a mental note to be careful, but I didn't think much of it at first. But after a few weeks, I began to notice something strange. At night, when I would climb the stairs, I felt a pressure on the steps, as though something was pushing back against me. It wasn't obvious at first, just a slight resistance, like the steps were unwilling to let me pass. Each time I stepped down, the wood groaned under my weight, but it wasn't just the sound of old wood. It was as if something beneath the stairs was shifting, moving. One evening, I woke up to the sound of faint footsteps on the stairs. It was the middle of the night, and I was alone in the house. The sound was soft at first, a slow, rhythmic thudding. I assumed it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again, louder this time, as if someone was climbing the stairs from below. I got up to check, but when I reached the stairs, they were empty. No one was there. But as I looked down, I noticed something odd. The steps had shifted, the edges worn down in a way that hadn't been there before. They seemed more uneven, more unstable. The next night, I decided to climb the stairs slowly, paying closer attention. With each step, I felt a subtle resistance, a slight pushback against my weight, as if something was pressing up from below. The farther I went, the more I felt the force growing, as though the stairs themselves were trying to pull me down. I quickly turned back, my heart racing. I knew something wasn't right. The staircase was not just old, it had become a trap, a passageway to something beneath the house. Something waiting for me. These stories continue in the same vein, subtle and creeping, with a growing sense of unease, building toward an unsettling realization without exaggeration. If you wish to continue or explore different themes, let me know. Story 11. The Forgotten Photograph. The photograph was tucked away in an old box I found in the attic. It had been years since I had gone through anything up there. The house had many hidden corners, and the attic was one of them, full of forgotten memories and discarded items. Dust and cobwebs covered everything, and the smell of old wood and paper hung in the air. I pulled out a few old albums, but there was one photograph that stood out among the rest. It was small, faded, and tucked into the corner of an old envelope. I didn't recognize the people in the photo, but there was something unsettling about it. The people in the picture were standing in front of the house, just as it was now. They smiled, their expressions neutral, almost forced. What disturbed me was the figure in the background. It wasn't a person, it was more like a shadow, a dark shape that blended into the trees behind them. At first, I thought it was just a flaw in the picture, perhaps a trick of the light. But as I stared at it, I realized it was not an imperfection at all. It was too clear, too present. I put the photograph down, dismissing it as a product of my overactive imagination. But the thought of that dark shape lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting. Later that evening, I stood in the living room, glancing at the corner where the house's window overlooked the yard. I hadn't thought about it much before, but the more I looked at the space, the more I realized something was off. The trees were still, but it was the space between them that felt wrong. The dark shape from the photograph seemed to linger there, as though it had followed me into the present. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises from outside, scratching at the windows, tapping on the walls. I turned on the lights and scanned the yard, but everything appeared still. The trees stood motionless in the moonlight, and nothing seemed out of place. But in the corner of the yard, just beyond the shadows of the trees, I saw something shift. I froze, staring into the darkness, waiting for my eyes to adjust. And for just a moment, I thought I saw the shape from the photograph. A tall figure standing still, just out of sight. The next day, I went back to the attic. I wanted to know more about the photograph and the people in it. But when I went through the box again, it was gone. The photograph, the envelope, everything. There was no sign of it, as though it had never been there at all. I tried to ignore it, but I knew better. The figure, the shadow, had been there long before I ever found the photograph. And somehow it was still watching, still waiting. The piano sat in the corner of the room, a large wooden instrument with chipped keys and tarnished pedals. It had been there when I moved in. I didn't know much about it except that it was old, likely passed down through generations. I hadn't thought much of it at first, as I wasn't particularly musically inclined. One evening, I found myself standing near it, inexplicably drawn to its presence. The house had fallen silent, the only sound the occasional creak of the wooden floor. I walked toward the piano and ran my fingers over the dusty surface. The wood felt cold, and a faint, eerie chill seemed to rise from it. Without thinking, I sat down on the bench. I hadn't played the piano in years, but my hands moved of their own accord, running lightly across the keys. A soft, dissonant note sounded. I quickly pulled my hands away, confused. The note hadn't been intentional. I tried again, pressing a few more keys, but the sound was wrong, off-key, out of tune. It seemed to vibrate strangely, as though the piano itself were not responding in a normal way. But as I pulled my fingers back, I heard a faint, lingering sound, a low hum, like something was resonating beneath the surface of the piano. That night, the house felt different. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creaks of the floorboards or the wind outside. But every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint notes of the piano, the low hum that seemed to echo through the house. The next evening, I sat in the room again, unable to shake the feeling that something was there, watching me. The piano seemed to call to me. I tried not to look at it, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I walked toward it and sat down again. My fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then, without thinking, I pressed down a key. The sound that followed was not a note. It was a long, drawn-out chord, low and distorted, vibrating in a way that felt wrong. The vibration deepened, growing more intense. The sound wasn't coming from the piano itself. It was coming from the walls, the floor, as though the entire house was resonating with the note. It felt as though the house was breathing, the sound reverberating through its very foundation. I tried to pull my hands away, but they wouldn't move. I was frozen, my fingers pressed down on the keys, the sound growing louder, sharper. The hum from the piano turned into a full-bodied tone that vibrated through my entire being, filling the room, making my teeth rattle. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The room went completely silent. I pulled my hands away and looked at the keys. They were untouched, as though nothing had happened. The piano was still, its surface unchanged. But the silence was unbearable. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't understand. I could feel something lingering in the room, just out of reach. It wasn't gone. And that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. The faint hum, the vibration, as though the piano were calling out from the other room. Story 13. I moved into the house on a whim, drawn by its simplicity and charm. It was a single-story home, small but comfortable. When I first toured the place, there was nothing unusual about it. It had all the features I needed, and the rent was affordable. I had no reason to question it. But when I moved in and started unpacking, I noticed something odd. There was a second door at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't hidden or locked, but I had never seen it before. It wasn't in the listing, and no one had mentioned it during the tour. The door was plain, unadorned, blending into the wall like it was part of the house's design. I assumed it must lead to a closet or a small storage room, so I didn't think much of it at first. But curiosity got the better of me one evening, and I decided to open it. When I turned the handle, the door opened easily, and I stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, as though it had not seen light in years. I couldn't see anything beyond a few inches from the door, but I could feel the air inside was cold and still. I hesitated, then stepped further into the room, feeling my way along the walls. The floor was damp beneath my feet, and I could hear the sound of water dripping somewhere deeper in the room. As I moved forward, I thought I saw something shift in the dark, a faint movement in the corner of my vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening thud, and I froze. The air grew colder, thicker. I felt a pressure building in the room, as though something were pressing in from all sides. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled and pulled at the door, panic rising as the room seemed to close in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had closed, the door swung open. I stumbled backward, gasping for breath. The hallway was just as it had been before. Empty, quiet. I stepped out of the room and shut the door, unsure of what had just happened. The door was there, just as ordinary as before. But I knew it wasn't. There was something in that room, something I couldn't see, but that was very real. I never opened it again. These stories continue with an unsettling, slow-building tension that creates an atmosphere of discomfort and unease, focusing on the things we don't fully understand or see. Let me know if you'd like more stories or a different direction. Story 14. The Cracked Wall. The house had stood for decades, its brick walls weathered and worn. I had rented the place for months, the rent affordable and the location ideal. There was one thing, though, that had always caught my attention: the wall at the far end of the living room. It wasn't particularly remarkable at first glance. It was just a simple wall, with a small window near the top and a door leading to the hallway. But there was something about it that felt wrong. Over time, I noticed it more and more. The small crack running down from the ceiling, just a thin line, almost invisible if you didn't look closely. At first, I dismissed it. Houses settle, after all. But as the weeks passed, the crack seemed to grow. It wasn't much, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to make me uneasy. The rest of the wall appeared untouched, but that crack seemed to spread slowly, as though something was pushing against it from behind. I decided to investigate. I didn't expect to find anything, but as I ran my fingers along the crack, I felt something shift behind the wall. It wasn't the sound of settling plaster, but something else. Something subtle, like a faint scraping noise, as though something was moving just out of reach. I quickly pulled my hand away, heart racing. The wall was still, silent again, but the crack continued to grow, inch by inch. It never stopped, no matter how much time passed. Each day, I would look at it, the line deepening ever so slightly. It wasn't the wall that was moving, it was something inside it. I stopped sleeping in the living room, but every time I passed the wall, I could feel it watching me. It was always there, waiting. The crack became more pronounced, more jagged, until one morning, it reached the floor. The scraping noise, once barely audible, became louder, more distinct. It was no longer just behind the wall. It was inside it. I didn't dare to investigate further. The presence behind the wall had become overwhelming, like it was trying to break free. The crack was no longer just a line. It was a gap, wide enough to see through. I could feel something staring back at me, something twisted, hidden, but undeniably there. I left the house shortly after, unable to bear the feeling any longer. When I returned to the house a month later to collect the rest of my things, the wall was intact. The crack was gone, completely sealed, as though it had never been there at all. I didn't stay long enough to check the rest of the house. Story 15. I moved into the old house just outside of town, not far from a quiet village that had mostly faded into obscurity. The house was modest, 2 stories, and though it had a worn-down quality to it, there was something comforting about its presence. It had been vacant for years, but there was no real reason to question it. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. But one evening, I noticed something odd: the upstairs window. It was the last window on the left, right above the staircase. The curtains were drawn, but as I passed by the window, I caught a glimpse of movement inside. A faint shape shifting in the dim light. I paused, staring at it. The room was still, the curtains untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside, standing just out of view. I assumed it was the wind, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks. It was an old house, after all, and the creaking of the wood at night often caused strange illusions. But the next evening, it happened again. The movement in the upstairs window. Something, or someone, was standing there, behind the curtains. I walked past the house a little faster, my steps quickening. The presence in the window felt unmistakable, though I couldn't explain it. As the days passed, I became more aware of the upstairs window. Each time I walked past, I glanced up, expecting to see the faint shadow of a figure inside. But I never did again, not until the day I decided to investigate. The house was silent, as always, and when I entered, everything seemed in order. The upstairs hallway was narrow, and at the far end, the window stood, curtains drawn. I hesitated but slowly walked toward it. There was nothing unusual, just the faint, muted light filtering through the fabric. I stood there for a moment, looking out into the street below, but then I noticed something strange. The curtain, which had appeared to be hanging loosely, was now pressed up against the window. I reached out to pull it back, but as soon as my hand touched the fabric, a cold breeze brushed past me. I opened the curtain fully, expecting to find only the empty room beyond. But when I looked, I saw nothing. No furniture, no sign of the room's contents. It was just a dark, hollow space, a void where nothing seemed to exist. I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room, if it even was a room, felt off, like it didn't belong. Something was missing. The window behind me, which I had always seen from the outside, now looked completely empty, as if the house itself had swallowed whatever had been there. That night, the wind blew through the house in a way I'd never heard before, a strange hum that seemed to echo from above. The upstairs window remained closed, but when I glanced at it from the street below, I thought I saw a faint shadow move across the curtain. The house has been empty since then. The window still remains, closed, silent, but every time I walk past, I feel the weight of whatever is behind it, waiting for me to look again. Story 16. The box under the floorboards. The house was quiet when I moved in, the kind of quiet that made you think it had secrets buried deep within its walls. There was an old wooden floor in the living room, uneven and cracked from age. I had always meant to fix it, but time passed, and I had no reason to hurry. Until one day, as I walked across the room, I felt something shift beneath my feet. The floorboard had given way under my weight. I knelt down, carefully prying it up, and found a small, dust-covered box hidden beneath. It was a simple wooden box, weathered with age. No locks or hinges, just a plain, nondescript item. I opened it cautiously, and inside, I found several old pieces of paper. They were faded, yellowed with time, but still legible. Each sheet was covered with strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. The more I looked, the more I felt an unsettling chill creeping into the room. The markings on the papers were not like anything I had ever seen before, and the sense of something watching me grew stronger with each passing second. I didn't know what the papers meant, but there was no mistaking the feeling I had. They were important. They had been hidden for a reason. I put the box back beneath the floorboard, but that night, the house felt different. The silence was heavy, as if the house itself were waiting for something. I tried to sleep, but the feeling of being watched kept me awake. When I woke the next morning, the box was gone. The floorboard was intact, the crack where I had found it sealed tight. The room looked as it had before, normal. But deep down, I knew something had changed. The house wasn't silent anymore. The quiet was thicker, more oppressive. The box had been taken. I didn't know by whom, or what. But whatever was waiting beneath the floorboards had no intention of letting me forget. Story 17. The room had always been locked. When I moved into the house, I was told not to worry about the door that led to the small room at the end of the hallway. It was always locked, and no one ever spoke about it. It wasn't mentioned in any of the house listings, nor did it appear in any of the original blueprints I came across. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another oddity of an old house, like so many others I'd lived in. For the first few months, I ignored the room entirely. The house itself was large and quiet, and there was little need to explore every corner. The door was small, with a simple iron keyhole, but it was always cold to the touch, even in the summer. It was one evening, as the weather grew colder and the wind howled outside, that I noticed something unusual. A faint draft began to seep under the door, cold and biting, unlike any draft I had felt in the rest of the house. I knelt down to feel it more closely, and it was unmistakable. The air coming from under the door was icy, sharper than the rest of the house. I couldn't help but wonder what was in that room, and why the cold was so persistent. That night, I decided to investigate. I searched around for the key, but it was nowhere to be found. After some time, I broke the lock with a small crowbar, the metal groaning as it gave way. The door opened slowly, and a blast of cold air rushed out, sending a shiver through my entire body. The room beyond was small, unremarkable, and covered in dust. There was nothing in it but an old rotting chair sitting in the center, and the walls were bare, the plaster peeling away in places. But the cold was unbearable. It wasn't just from the temperature. It felt as if the room itself had been frozen in time, as though it had been untouched for years, centuries perhaps. The chill pressed down on me, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe fully. I stepped inside, cautiously, trying to get a sense of the space. The air inside was thick, still. I could feel it pushing back against me, almost as if it didn't want me there. The chair in the middle of the room creaked, as though it had been disturbed by my presence. A layer of frost had formed along the edges of the windowsill, even though the rest of the house remained warm. I walked around the room, but it felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. The closer I moved to the walls, the colder it became. I shuddered, but there was no sign of any source for the intense cold. No window left ajar, no open vent. It was as if the room had been frozen from the inside. I quickly left the room, locking the door behind me. But the cold stayed with me, lingering in my skin, in my thoughts. It felt as though something in the room had attached itself to me, following me around the house. Even though I was back in the warmth of the living room, the chill didn't leave me. Over the next few days, the cold became more pronounced. It wasn't just in the room anymore. The draft was now in the hallway, in the kitchen, and sometimes I could feel it creeping into my bedroom. The house was cold, colder than it had ever been. I wrapped myself in blankets, lit the fire, and tried to ignore the sensation of being watched. But the cold kept spreading, coming from nowhere, filling every corner of the house. I tried to lock the door again, but it wouldn't stay shut. No matter how much I pushed it, the door was slightly ajar, the cold spilling out into the house, unbearable and constant. I haven't been able to bring myself to enter the room again. The cold remains, and every night I can hear the creak of the chair, as if it's waiting for me to return. Story 18. The carpet in the living room was old, but it was soft underfoot. When I moved in, it had been covered in dust, the color faded from years of neglect. It was a dull shade of red with intricate patterns, the threads worn in places, but it still held some of its former beauty. The landlord had assured me it was fine, that nothing was wrong with it. Over time, however, I began to notice something strange. A stain appeared in the corner of the carpet. It wasn't large, just a small blotch that seemed to seep into the fibers. I figured it was a result of the old age of the carpet, but I couldn't quite get rid of it. No matter how much I scrubbed, the stain remained, as if the carpet had absorbed something that wouldn't let go. Days passed, and the stain grew larger. At first, it was just a slight discoloration, but soon it became a dark, reddish-brown blotch that seemed to spread, twisting outward like veins. It didn't make sense. It wasn't like a normal stain. It wasn't from any spill or accident. It just appeared one day, and then it kept growing. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The more I tried to clean it, the worse it became. The edges of the stain were jagged, as though it was spreading with intent. And soon, I realized that it wasn't just the carpet that had changed. The air in the room felt different. Heavier, thicker, like the very atmosphere had been contaminated by the stain. At night, when I lay in bed, I could feel something else in the room. It was a presence, something quiet, waiting, as though the stain had awakened something beneath the carpet, something that had been lying dormant for years. One evening, I decided to pull the carpet back and see what lay beneath. I couldn't explain why I felt the need to do it, but I had to know. I slowly rolled the carpet up, the fibers lifting and curling, and when I reached the spot where the stain was, I froze. The wood beneath the carpet was blackened, scorched, as though something had burned into it. The edges of the floorboards were singed. The dark marks spread across the wood like a fire had once consumed the very foundation of the house. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the blackened area, I saw something more. Small, jagged marks, as if something had been scratched into the wood. I knelt down to inspect them, but the closer I got, the more I realized they weren't just scratches. They were symbols, carved deeply into the floor, symbols I didn't recognize. I quickly covered the spot, but I could feel the weight of it, the presence still lingering in the room. The stain continued to spread, no matter what I did, and the house grew colder, more oppressive, with each passing day. Story 19. The Hollow Sound. The house was near the edge of town, quiet and isolated. I moved in looking for peace, wanting to escape the bustle of city life. The walls were thick, the rooms large, and the space felt like it could swallow up any noise. But over time, I began to hear something strange. At first, it was subtle, a faint, hollow sound coming from the walls. I didn't think much of it. Old houses creak and groan, after all. The sound seemed to be coming from the pipes, from the space behind the walls where old plumbing and wiring lived. But it grew louder. Late at night, I would hear it. A hollow thud, a dull thumping that seemed to echo throughout the house. It wasn't a single sound. It was rhythmic, like something was tapping against the walls from the inside. I couldn't locate where it was coming from. It seemed to move through the house, starting in one room and then moving to another. The sound became more distinct over time, like someone was knocking on the walls from behind. I checked the pipes, the wiring, the foundations, but everything seemed intact. There was no reason for the noise. I tried to ignore it, but it persisted, night after night. I began to feel like I was being followed by the sound, as though something was inside the walls, waiting for the right moment to break free. One evening, I could no longer stand it. I grabbed a hammer and started knocking on the wall where the sound was coming from, hoping to break through whatever was causing it. The hollow sound intensified, and I swung harder, hitting the wall with all my strength. Suddenly, the wall cracked, and I stepped back. A dark space appeared behind the plaster, and when I peered inside, I saw nothing. Just darkness. But the sound, it was coming from within that darkness, from the empty space behind the wall. I couldn't look away, even as the thumping grew louder, as though something was trying to reach through the hole I had made. I backed away, leaving the hole open. The sound stopped, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The next morning, the wall was whole again, as though nothing had ever happened. The thumping had stopped, but I knew it was still there, deep inside the walls, just beyond reach. Story 20. The house was near a river, the sound of running water constant. but not intrusive. The riverbank was just a short walk from the house, and the sound of the water became background noise to my daily routine. But there was something wrong about the water, something unsettling about its never-ending flow. I noticed it the first time I tried to leave. I went outside to get something from the shed, but the river was much closer than I remembered. In fact, it had crept up overnight, its edge now only a few feet from the back door. I couldn't understand how it had moved so suddenly, how it had gotten so close. The water continued to rise, steadily, silently. I kept an eye on it, but every time I looked, it had shifted a little closer, until one morning it was lapping at the steps leading up to the house. I checked the river, but the water wasn't high. It didn't seem to be rising from the bank. It was like the water itself was moving toward the house, a slow, relentless force that couldn't be stopped. It wasn't long before the first floor was flooded. I didn't know how it happened, but every time I tried to drain the water, it only came back. The house was slowly filling up, the water creeping in, day by day, until the ground floor was submerged. I thought I could leave, but the door wouldn't open. The water was everywhere, flowing through the rooms, over the floors. I had no choice but to retreat to the upper floors, but the water followed. It filled every room, rushing up the stairs, pushing me higher. The water didn't stop. It never stopped, no matter how far I went. Story 21. I had been living in the house for several months when I first noticed it. There was a door at the far end of the hallway, tucked away between two rooms. It was odd because it had no markings, no handle, nothing that would suggest it was a door at all. At first, I thought it was just a part of the wall, an unfinished section perhaps, but over time, it became impossible to ignore. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed out of place. I spent days walking past it, telling myself that I didn't need to know what was behind it. But the curiosity started to gnaw at me. I couldn't understand why it was there, why it had never been opened or even acknowledged. One night, after coming home from work, I found myself standing before it, my hand hovering just above the space where the doorknob should have been. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but the pull to open it was undeniable. My fingers brushed against the smooth surface, and to my surprise, the door creaked open, its frame barely giving way. Inside was an empty room, or at least it looked empty at first. The floor was bare, covered only in dust and debris. But there was something about the room that felt different, something that made the air feel heavier, as though the space had been untouched for a very long time. I stepped inside cautiously, unsure of what I was supposed to find. But as I moved deeper into the room, I noticed the walls. They weren't plain like the rest of the house. They were covered in markings, faint scratches that seemed to form patterns. I couldn't make sense of them. They weren't words, not symbols I recognized, just strange, jagged lines that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A strange noise filled the room, soft at first, almost imperceptible. It was a low hum, like the air itself was vibrating, resonating in the walls. It grew stronger, pulsing, as if the room had become alive, echoing with a presence that didn't belong. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The hum intensified, and the air grew colder. I tried to pry the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel something, some force, pressing in from all sides. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door creaked open again. The room was unchanged, as if nothing had happened, but the hum had stopped. The markings on the walls, though, had shifted. They weren't in the same arrangement as before. The patterns had changed subtly, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they were watching me. I backed out of the room, and the door clicked shut behind me. I never opened it again. The unmarked door still stands at the end of the hallway, and sometimes when I walk by, I can feel it pulling at me, calling to me. But I know better now. Some things are not meant to be opened. Story 22. When I moved into the house, I found an old radio in the basement. It wasn't anything special. just a dusty vintage piece with wooden panels and a glass face. It didn't work when I tried it, of course, but I thought it would be a nice decoration for the living room. It sat there for weeks, forgotten, until one evening when I was sitting alone in the dark. The radio, for reasons I couldn't explain, suddenly turned on. It wasn't a loud, jarring sound, but a soft hum that filled the room. I turned to look at it, expecting static or broken signals, but instead, there was complete silence coming from the speaker. The dial on the front was moving slowly, flicking through frequencies, yet there was no sound, not even white noise. I thought it was a malfunction. The house was old, and sometimes things just happened. But every night, without fail, the radio would turn on again. It didn't matter if I unplugged it or turned it off. It would always be on the next evening, silently flicking through the stations, never emitting a sound. It started to get under my skin. The radio became an unsettling presence in the house, always there, always running in the background. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me. I would go to the kitchen to make tea, and when I returned, it would be on, silently humming, its dial moving by itself. The thought of it, the constant flicking of the dial, the silence that felt like it was alive, began to make me feel claustrophobic. One night, I decided to confront it. I unplugged the radio again, but as I turned away, the hum started again, faint but unmistakable. I rushed back to the radio, trying to plug it back in, but before I could, I saw it. The dial was spinning on its own, moving rapidly through the frequencies, faster than any radio should be able to turn. I backed away slowly, feeling a cold chill crawl up my spine. The hum grew louder, louder still, until it reached a deafening pitch, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound itself. I turned around, my heart pounding, and saw nothing. The room was still, the radio turned off and unplugged. From that night on, the radio never turned on again, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the house. Every time I sat in the living room, I could hear the faintest hum in the air, like the radio was still flicking through stations just out of my reach. I lived alone in a house that had once been beautiful, but over the years, the house had begun to show signs of wear. The walls were cracked, and the paint was peeling. I didn't mind it. It felt lived in, familiar. One evening, while cleaning out the attic, I found an old wooden chest tucked in the corner. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, its edges worn from years of neglect. I opened the chest, half expecting to find a collection of forgotten trinkets, but instead, I found an old leather-bound journal. It was thick, its pages yellowed and brittle, but the writing was still legible. I sat down on the floor of the attic and began to read, my fingers brushing over the words. The journal belonged to the previous owner of the house, a man who had lived there many years before me. He wrote of strange occurrences, water stains that appeared overnight, despite there being no leaks, and a strange pattern that formed in the wallpaper that no one could explain. As I read further, the entries became more frantic. The stains in the house, he wrote, had a life of their own, and they were slowly creeping across the walls, as though they were trying to claim the house. The final entry in the journal was short and unsettling. The house has begun to drown. I put the journal down and looked around the attic. The air felt heavier, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. I stood up and walked back downstairs, feeling a growing unease. That night, as I was preparing to go to bed, I noticed it for the first time, the watermark on the living room wall. It wasn't large, just a small, dark stain that seemed to seep through the paint, slowly spreading across the surface. It was strange. I hadn't noticed it before, and I couldn't understand how it had appeared so suddenly. I wiped it off with a cloth, but it didn't stay gone. The next day, the stain was back, bigger, darker. The next day, it spread further across the wall, as if it were alive, growing inch by inch. Over time, the stains began to appear in other places in the house. The floorboards started to warp, and the walls seemed to sweat. I realized with growing dread that the house wasn't just decaying, it was being consumed by something beneath the surface. Something from the journal, something that had always been there, just waiting. Story 24. The house sat on a quiet street, the windows overlooking an empty street lined with trees. I had been living there for a few months when I first noticed the noise. It started quietly, just a faint rattling from one of the windows in the back room. I didn't think much of it at first. The house was old, after all, and old windows tend to rattle in the wind. But the rattling grew more persistent, night after night. It wasn't the sound of wind against glass. It was rhythmic, like something was tapping against the window from the outside. I checked the window, but it was sealed tight, no cracks, no holes. Still, the rattling continued. I would lay in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, waiting for it to stop. Sometimes I would get up to check, but when I went to the window, it would be silent, still. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the noise kept coming back, louder and louder each time. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the window, the sound immediately stopping. There was nothing outside, just the quiet, dark yard, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I leaned out, scanning the yard, and that's when I saw it. There was a shadow standing beneath one of the trees, just outside the reach of the light. It didn't move. It just stood there, still and watching. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. The rattling started again. I closed the window, but it didn't stop. Every night, the rattling grew louder, until it was impossible to ignore. I started to feel like I was being watched, trapped in my own home. It was always there, waiting for the moment I couldn't ignore it any longer. Story 25. It was a dreary afternoon when I first stumbled upon the abandoned house. Hidden deep in the woods, the place had always been a subject of local rumors, but I had never paid much attention to them. I had recently moved to a nearby town, and after hearing whispers from my neighbors, I couldn't resist the urge to explore the place myself. As I made my way through the dense trees, the house gradually came into view. It was a large, imposing structure with ivy creeping up the stone walls. The windows were shattered, and the front door hung loosely on its hinges. Despite the eerie appearance, a part of me was curious, eager to uncover the secrets that lay within. I hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took was met with the sound of creaking floorboards. The house seemed to have been untouched for years. Old furniture covered in tattered sheets lined the hallways, and remnants of faded photographs adorned the walls. As I ventured deeper into the house, the temperature dropped, and a strange, unsettling feeling settled over me. The hallway seemed endless, and I soon realized that no matter how much I walked, the rooms didn't change. The walls were covered in what looked like strange symbols, their meaning unclear but oddly familiar. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, shifting around me. I finally found my way to the basement, and that's when things took a turn for the worse. The door creaked open with a chilling sound, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the unknown. My heart raced, but curiosity pushed me forward. I descended slowly, my feet echoing in the silence. At the bottom, I saw a flicker of light, an old lantern resting on a dusty table. The closer I got, the more I realized that the basement wasn't just a storage space. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to those in the hallway, but this time, they seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I felt something moving behind me, a presence that wasn't there before. I turned quickly, but the basement was empty. As I turned back to face the lantern, I felt a cold breath on my neck. My skin crawled as I spun around, but again, there was nothing. The air seemed heavier now, suffocating. The lantern flickered once more, casting long, twisted shadows on the walls. I tried to turn to leave, but the door slammed shut. The temperature dropped further, and the basement seemed to stretch out before me. I could hear whispers, soft and unintelligible, growing louder by the second. My legs shook as I backed into a corner, my mind racing. The shadows began to move, shifting and warping in ways that defied logic. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming pressure on my chest. as if something was forcing the life out of me. I gasped for air, but none came. I reached out, but there was nothing to grab. My vision blurred, and the whispers became screams. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I awoke outside the house, the light of the morning sun casting a pale glow over the landscape. My body was aching, and my clothes were soaked in sweat. The house loomed in the distance, silent and unmoving. I never went back, but the whispers never left my mind. I could still hear them in the quiet moments, just beyond my reach. Story 27. I have always been an avid collector of antiques. There's something about owning pieces of history, artifacts that have stood the test of time, that fascinates me. One day, while browsing through an old thrift store, I came across a stunning antique mirror. It was framed in intricately carved wood, and the glass itself seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly gleam. The moment I saw it, I knew I had to have it. I brought the mirror home and placed it in my bedroom. It seemed to fit perfectly with the rest of my collection, but there was something unsettling about it. At first, I dismissed the strange feeling, but over time, I began to notice small, inexplicable changes. The reflection in the mirror was never quite the same as reality. At night, I would see things in the reflection that weren't there in the room. Shadows that moved without explanation. Figures that seemed to linger just beyond the edges of the glass. I tried to ignore it at first, but it became impossible. The mirror seemed to call to me, and no matter how much I tried to avoid looking into it, I found myself drawn to it. One evening, as I stood before it, I noticed something different. My reflection wasn't matching my movements. I raised my right hand, but the reflection raised its left. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I backed away, but the reflection continued to move, as if it were alive. Then, something horrifying happened. The reflection began to smile. It was a twisted, grotesque smile that seemed to stretch beyond the confines of what was possible. I could feel my pulse quicken, my heart racing as I tried to turn away, but I was frozen in place, unable to look away. The reflection's smile widened, and I saw its eyes shift. They weren't mine. They were dark, empty pits, void of life, and filled with a malevolent force. I felt something pulling me toward the mirror, an invisible force that threatened to consume me. With all my strength, I broke free from the trance and stumbled backward. The mirror rattled violently, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. The moment passed, and everything fell silent. The next day, I sold the mirror. I didn't care how much I lost on it. I never wanted to see it again. But the worst part was when I looked in my bedroom mirror for the last time. I saw the reflection standing behind me. It wasn't me. It was the thing from the other mirror, smiling that same twisted smile. Story 28. It was supposed to be a simple hike. A weekend escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. I packed my gear, grabbed some snacks, and set off into the woods. The weather was perfect for an outdoor adventure, and I was eager to experience the serenity of nature. Little did I know that this trip would turn into a nightmare. I had been hiking for hours, enjoying the solitude and the sounds of the forest. But as the day wore on, I began to feel uneasy. There was no real reason for it, nothing tangible. Yet, something about the woods felt wrong. The birds had stopped chirping, and the wind seemed to have died down. It was as if the forest had become eerily quiet, holding its breath. Then, I saw him. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. He was tall, dressed in tattered clothes that seemed out of place for someone out here. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with a vacant expression. I called out, but he didn't respond. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or maybe a lost hiker. But the longer I watched, the more certain I became that something wasn't right. His presence felt unnatural. I turned and began to walk away, quickening my pace. I glanced back, and the man was closer now, just standing there, motionless. I broke into a run, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the woods. Every time I looked back, he was there, always closer, always just out of reach. I pushed through the trees, my breath ragged, my legs burning. The woods seemed to close in around me, the path disappearing into thick brush. I was lost, and the man was still following. Finally, I reached a clearing, a small patch of open ground where I could see the sky. But the man wasn't far behind. I could hear his breathing now, heavy and labored. I stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, but before I could make it, something cold wrapped around my ankle. I fell, face first into the dirt. As I struggled to get up, I saw his shadow looming over me. His hands reached down, long fingers curling around my wrist. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was his face, a twisted, hollow visage, smiling as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. When they found my body, it was deep in the woods. There were no signs of a struggle, no sign of the man. The authorities concluded that I had simply gotten lost and had died of exposure. But I know what happened. I saw him, and I wasn't the first. Story 29. I had always been skeptical of ghost stories and supernatural occurrences. So, when I began seeing the shadow, I chalked it up to overactive imagination. It started small, just a flicker at the edge of my vision, but soon it became harder to ignore. The shadow followed me everywhere. At night, I would catch glimpses of it as I passed through the hallway. During the day, it was there, lurking in the corners of my rooms. It never took shape, never fully revealed itself, but it was always there, waiting. At first, I thought I was just tired. But then, things began to escalate. I started to hear footsteps behind me, even when I was alone. The shadow grew darker, more defined. It would follow me from room to room, never leaving my side. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I stood in front of the mirror, waiting for it to appear. The air grew thick with tension as I stared into my own reflection, the shadow stretching across the walls behind me. Then, it happened. The shadow lunged at me. I screamed, but no sound escaped. The darkness enveloped me, suffocating me with an unnatural cold. I could feel it pressing against my skin, its weight crushing me. And then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The next morning, I was found collapsed on the floor. My body was cold to the touch, my eyes wide open in terror. The doctors couldn't explain it, but I knew. The shadow had finally claimed me. Story 30. For weeks, I had been hearing strange noises coming from the walls. At first, it sounded like the faint scratching of nails, as if something was trying to escape. I dismissed it as rodents, but the sounds became more persistent. Late at night, I could hear them clearly. Soft thumping, like something large moving inside the walls. I called an exterminator, who came and checked for any signs of pests. He found nothing. Still, the noises continued, growing louder, more frantic. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I began tearing down the walls, convinced that something was trapped inside. To my horror, I found a hidden room. It was small, barely big enough for a person to crawl into. The air inside was stale, suffocating, and the walls were covered in strange markings. At the far end of the room was a figure, a man, or what had once been a man. His skin was pale and stretched tightly over his bones. His eyes were wide open, but empty, staring into nothingness. I recoiled in horror as I realized the truth. The man had been trapped here for years. His body had been preserved by the dark energy in the walls, but his mind had not. Suddenly, the walls shook. The noises grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel something moving inside them. The man's eyes began to twitch, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. I tried to escape, but the walls were closing in, and the darkness was all around me. The last thing I heard was the scratching. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was coming from inside me. These stories are designed to evoke a sense of dread and curiosity, keeping the reader engaged while subtly building up to an unnerving conclusion. Each story leaves you with lingering questions, making the horror even more unsettling.